The photograph lived in Garrett Holt's shirt pocket, folded twice along creases worn soft from handling. Diane on their back porch, summer light, catching the side of her face, laughing at something just outside the frame. He couldn't remember what had made her laugh that day. That was the part that kept him up some nights, not her absence, but the details. He was already losing the specific texture of ordinary moments, dissolving the way dreams do an hour after waking. He sat in the rental car in the parking structure of the Aldridge Grand in Concord, New Hampshire, engine off, listening to the silence that follows when you've driven 2 hours alone with your own thoughts and run out of ways to outrun them. His phone buzzed. Wren calling from her grandmother's house in Hartford, her voice arriving before he could fully raise the phone to his ear. "Did you get there yet?" "Sitting in the parking garage right now." "Did you brush your hair?" Garrett laughed, despite himself. 7 years old, and she asked the questions that mattered. "I brushed my hair, Wren." "Mommy always said you forgot." A pause the kind children fill with the weight of things they understand better than they should. "Daddy, you promised you'd try to make a friend." "I know I promised." "A real one. Not just someone you talk to about work stuff." He looked down at the photograph. "I'll try." "Be brave," Wren said with the absolute certainty of someone who had never had reason to doubt him, which made it both easier and harder to hear. The call ended, and Garrett sat another 30 seconds in the dark of the parking structure before he put the photograph back in his pocket, straightened his tie, a dark navy one Wren had picked, because she said it made him look like someone who knew things, and got out of the car. The Aldridge Grand operated on the logic of old New England money, which meant restraint weaponized as elegance. The lobby offered no excess that announced itself. Instead, it accumulated quietly, the particular density of the carpet underfoot, the brass fixtures polished to a warmth that felt curated rather than cared for, the arrangement of white orchids that managed to suggest both abundance and austerity at once. It was the kind of place where the help moved like shadows, and the guests moved like they owned the shadows too. Garrett had attended enough corporate functions in spaces like this to know he could pass for someone who belonged, provided nobody looked too closely at his department store suit or noticed he'd parked in the self-park structure instead of using the valet. The reception hall occupied the east wing of the hotel, its entrance flanked by 2 young men in white gloves who checked names against a list with the practiced efficiency of people paid to make exclusion feel like hospitality. Garrett gave his name. He was attending as a guest of the groom, who worked in the same accounting firm and had invited 2 colleagues as a courtesy gesture, and was waved through into a room so committed to its own grandeur that it momentarily replaced thought with sensation. Crystal chandeliers hung at 3 intervals down the length of the hall, each throwing light that fractured against the silk tablecloths in patterns that shifted when the ventilation stirred the air. 8-person tables filled the main floor, each dressed identically, orchid centerpieces built to a height that required guests to either lean around them or accept that conversation would be limited to the 2 people immediately flanking you. The jazz quartet in the far corner played something Garrett didn't recognize. Sophisticated and just slightly melancholy. The kind of music chosen to signal taste rather than create joy. 400 candles burning on surfaces throughout the room provided the warmth the light fixtures refused to. He found his table near the center of the room, accountants and their spouses already deep into a conversation about quarterly projections that had apparently begun in the car. Margaret Solis, who processed payroll and had been trying to set Garrett up with her dental hygienist sister for 6 months, patted the empty seat beside her and handed him a champagne flute before he'd fully settled. "You made it. I wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I said I'd come." "You say a lot of things, Garrett." She said it warmly, which was the only way Margaret said anything. "The salmon is supposed to be excellent. James already asked the server twice." James from Accounts Payable raised his glass in confirmation. Garrett set his champagne down untouched, and that was when he saw her. She was standing at the entrance to the hall, and the specific quality of her stillness was what registered first, not the absence of movement exactly, but the presence of absolute control over it. A young woman in a beige dress, her dark hair pulled back in a style that was careful without being fussy, holding a small card between the fingers of her right hand. Her left sleeve was pinned just below the shoulder with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who had long ago decided that the accommodation required no apology and no explanation. She was reading the card. Then she looked up and scanned the room with the expression of someone confirming what they already knew. A hotel employee appeared at her elbow, the professional smile performing its function. He said something and gestured toward the far left corner of the room, past 3 rows of round tables, past the edge of the main floor to a spot half obscured by a large potted palm that had seen better seasons, its lower fronds yellowing its soil cracked at the edges. Behind it sat a folding table covered with a paper cloth. A single-place setting centered on it with the miserable precision of someone who had followed instructions they found uncomfortable. The chair was a folding chair. Everything at every other table in the room was upholstered. She followed the employee without hesitation, and that the lack of hesitation was the thing that lodged itself somewhere behind Garrett's sternum and refused to move. He watched her cross the room. The crossing took longer than it should have because the main tables were arranged with the generous spacing of a room that hadn't accounted for this particular path, or perhaps had accounted for it exactly, had designed the geography of the evening to make sure this transit happened in full view of everyone while remaining technically adjacent to everything. 200 guests in gowns and tailored suits continued their conversations. Some looked up and looked away again with the choreographed disinterest of people who had decided in advance that not seeing was the same as not being responsible. A woman at the table nearest Garrett's didn't bother lowering her voice. "I honestly can't believe Vivian actually invited her, after everything the family has done for that girl." The woman beside her, long pearl earrings catching the candlelight. "You know why she was invited. Appearances. Can't exactly leave her off the guest list without someone asking why." Garrett picked up his champagne flute. Put it back down. The young woman reached the table behind the palm and sat. Her back straightened the moment she was in the chair. Not the straightening of someone performing dignity, but of someone whose body had learned to hold itself upright as a matter of survival, the way structures under sustained pressure develop load-bearing adaptations. She placed the card on the table in front of her, smoothed the paper cloth once with her right hand, and looked out at the ice sculpture of 2 swans positioned at the center of the room, far enough away that the detail would have been difficult to make out from where she sat. Garrett had been to grief counseling twice in the 3 years since Diane died, both times at his mother-in-law's insistence, both times producing the sensation of watching himself from a moderate distance, while a professional asked useful questions he answered with half his attention. The counselor had said in the second session, grief isolates in layers. First, it takes the person. Then it takes your sense of how the world is supposed to work. Then it takes your capacity for outrage on behalf of others, because outrage requires energy and energy requires hope. And hope is the first casualty. He'd thought at the time that it sounded clinical. He thought about it now, watching a 22-year-old woman sit alone behind a dying plant at her own sister's wedding. And he felt the outrage arrive with a clarity that surprised him, clean and specific, the way pain is sometimes almost a relief after prolonged numbness. "Excuse me." Margaret touched his arm. "Are you listening? James is trying to settle a bet about the estate tax threshold." "Give me a minute," Garrett said. He didn't move yet. He turned it over the way you turn over a decision that seems simple and is therefore probably not simple. He was a guest of the groom. He didn't know this family. He didn't know the young woman behind the palm or the specific history that had placed her there. There were any number of explanations, any number of reasons a person could construct if the goal was the construction of reasons rather than the acknowledgement of what was plainly visible. And Garrett was good at constructing reasons. He had been constructing reasons for 3 years. Reasons why it was fine to skip neighborhood block parties, reasons why Wren's school functions were satisfying substitutes for adult social contact, reasons why the space beside him at the dinner table felt like a choice rather than an absence. He was, in the specific language of the grief counselor, highly functional and deeply habituated to his own isolation. He thought about Wren. Be brave. He thought about Diane, the way she would have already been halfway across the room. He thought about the sound Warren Aldridge's voice had made 20 minutes ago in the corridor outside the restrooms, carrying with the particular ease of a man who'd never had reason to moderate his volume. Garrett had been checking his phone, half listening, when the words organized themselves into meaning, best decision we ever made from a business standpoint. 30 million in new contracts the year after the adoption. Companies wanted to be associated with the family. The optics were worth more than we'd projected. The other man had said something Garrett couldn't hear, and Warren had laughed, a short, satisfied sound. Compassion is a balance sheet item if you know how to manage it. Garrett set down his champagne flute with more care than the action required, because if he wasn't careful he was going to set it down too hard. He stood up. "Garrett," Margaret's hand on his sleeve, "they're about to serve the first course." He gently removed her hand from his arm. The gesture was unhurried and left no room for misinterpretation. Then he crossed the room. Each step had a particular quality to it that he would not have been able to articulate in the moment, but that felt later like the physical experience of waking up, not the gentle kind of waking, but the sudden kind, when something breaks the surface and you find you've been holding your breath without knowing it. He was aware of eyes tracking his movement. He was aware of the jazz quartet pivoting into something slower and more minor. He was aware that what he was doing was the kind of thing people in this room would discuss later as either touching or disruptive depending on which side of the table they'd been sitting on, and he found that he could not locate anywhere in himself a reserve of concern about it. She didn't look up when his shadow crossed the table. He understood immediately that this was not rudeness. It was the trained response of someone who had learned that looking up was the beginning of a sequence hope, then the correction of hope, and that not initiating was a form of self-protection. He pulled out the chair across from her without asking, and the sound of it scraping against the floor was what finally made her raise her eyes. They were dark, her eyes, and carrying the particular quality of alertness that belongs to people who have learned to read rooms quickly to assess in the first 2 seconds whether a situation is going to cost them something. She looked at him the way you look at a contract before signing, not with suspicion exactly, but with the understanding that the print worth reading is usually the smallest. "I'm Garrett Holt." He kept his voice low, not conspiratorial, but considerate, the volume of a person who understood that this conversation was hers to control. "I work with Thomas, the groom." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the head table without looking away from her. "I noticed you were sitting alone." "It's fine." The words arrived practiced automatic, carrying the specific flatness of a sentence that has been used so many times it is worn smooth. "This is where I was assigned." "I know." He leaned forward slightly. "My daughter is 7. She made me promise this morning to make at least one real friend at this wedding. Not a work friend. A real one." He let a beat pass. "She worries I've been too much in my own head since her mother passed." Something shifted in her expression, not softening exactly, but a recalibration, the kind that happens when a piece of information arrives that doesn't fit the category you'd prepared for it. "She sounds perceptive," the young woman said carefully, "wiser than she has any right to be at 7. He held her gaze. "Here's what I'm asking. My table has an empty seat, and I have spent the last 20 minutes hearing about federal tax codes, and I genuinely cannot survive another 40 minutes of it without outside intervention. Would you do me the considerable favor of acting like you're with me, just for the reception?" She searched his face. He could see her doing it, looking for the angle, the joke, the cruelty that must be concealed somewhere behind a statement that generous, because in her experience generosity of this specificity always had a mechanism. He held still and let her look. Whatever she found or didn't find produced a silence that lasted several seconds before she said quietly, "People will stare. They're already staring." He stood and offered his arm. "Let them get it out of their system." Her name was Nora Calloway, and she placed her right hand in the crook of his elbow with the tentative precision of someone completing an action for the first time in a long time, or perhaps for the first time full stop. They crossed the room together, and the whispering that followed in their wake moved through the crowd, the way wind moves through a field, bending things in sequence. He introduced her at his table simply without preamble. "This is Nora." Margaret's mouth opened. James stopped mid-sip. Garrett pulled out the empty chair beside his own with the ease of someone for whom this was the only natural thing to do, and Nora sat and the table rearranged its expression into something approximating normalcy, because when a thing is done with sufficient certainty, the room tends to follow. Nora. Margaret found her footing first because Margaret always found her footing. Are you a friend of the bride's? A pause, almost imperceptible. I'm her sister. The table absorbed this. Garrett picked up his champagne flute and finally drank. For the next 20 minutes the conversation managed itself, Margaret carrying most of it with the practiced warmth of someone who had hosted 30 years of awkward work events. James contributing observations about the floral arrangements that nobody had requested, but that functioned as social mortar. Nora spoke carefully in complete sentences, the way people speak when they have spent years in environments where the wrong word had consequences. She was sharp that came through even in the constrained context, and occasionally something almost like dry humor surfaced before she reeled it back like a person who had gotten in the habit of catching themselves. Garrett watched this with the particular attention of someone who has spent 3 years learning the specific geometry of other people's defenses, because grief will teach you that if nothing else, how to recognize the architecture of a person who has organized their entire manner around not requiring more from the world than the world has committed to giving. Then he saw Vivian Aldridge watching from across the room. The bride had been moving through the reception with the fluid efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the choreography of her own wedding to granular precision, touching shoulders, accepting embraces, producing laughter on cue. She was beautiful in the calculated way of people who have understood since adolescence that beauty is a form of capital and managed it accordingly. Her dress had the specific gravity of something that cost what a family sedan costs. She moved like she owned the air in any room she entered, which she probably did or believed she did, which amounted to the same thing in practice. But when her circuit of the room brought her gaze to the table where Garrett sat beside her sister, she stopped. Not physically, her feet kept moving. Her smile held, but something behind the expression ceased. Her eyes went to Nora, then to Garrett, then back to Nora, and in the space of that transit, Garrett saw something he hadn't expected to see on the face of a woman at her own wedding reception. Not anger, not surprise, fear. The particular fear of someone watching a thing they had carefully arranged begin to come undone, which meant the arrangement had been deliberate, which meant everything Garrett had read into the situation from a table away had been, if anything, an underestimation. He filed it, said nothing. Nora had not seen Vivian's face, or if she had, she gave no indication. She was answering a question of Margaret's about her work. She'd been at a public library branch for 4 years, she said, acquisition and cataloging, which she delivered in a tone suggesting she expected the information to land as either boring or inadequate, and was prepared for either outcome. I loved the library, Margaret said with a sincerity that was distinctly her own. When my kids were small, we went every Saturday. There was a woman who did story time who could do about 20 different voices. Something in Nora's face moved. Not quite a smile, but its precursor. The children's programming is usually where the real work happens. She paused, and the pause had a different quality than her previous ones, less guarded. I run a reading group on Tuesday afternoons, 6 kids, 7 to 10. Last week we spent 40 minutes arguing about whether the wolf in a picture book was lying or just confused about reality. What did you decide? Margaret asked. We decided it mattered which one was true because the solution is different depending on the answer. Another pause. 7-year-olds are better philosophers than they get credit for. Garrett thought of Wren, who had told him last month that death was probably just moving to a different kind of time. He thought Diane would have liked that. He thought for the first time in a while that he was glad he'd gotten out of the car. It was James who noticed the couple, first Warren and Constance Aldridge, moving through the outer ring of tables with the coordinated purposefulness of people approaching something they intended to manage. Warren was ruddy and broad, his face carrying the particular flush of a man who had been drinking since the afternoon cocktail hour and was now in the more expansive second phase. Constance moved with extraordinary control, every gesture calibrated her silk dress in a shade of steel blue that matched, not coincidentally, the color of absolute certainty. Nora saw them 3 seconds after Garrett did. He knew because her shoulders moved just slightly, just enough to be perceptible to someone sitting close enough to notice, and her spine made that adaptation again, the load-bearing one, the one that cost her something every time. "There's something I need to tell you." Her voice dropped to just above the ambient noise of the room. "Before they get here, this is going to get complicated, and I don't want you to feel like you walked into something I didn't warn you about." "I walked in voluntarily," Garrett said. "You walked in without information. Tell me now, then." She looked at him with an expression that was the distilled version of everything he'd observed in her across the last half hour. The assessment, the wariness, but now threaded through with something that hadn't been there before, which was the particular vulnerability of someone who has been alone with the truth for a long time and has finally found a surface to put it down on. "They adopted me when I was 12, after a car accident took my parents and my arm." She said it without affect, the way you report something you've reported many times. "The company was bleeding money. My father Warren needed the press coverage. Taking in a disabled orphan after a tragedy was exactly the kind of story that turns a liability quarter into a forgiveness narrative." A beat. "I heard him say it. I was 13. I was in the hallway outside his study, and I heard him explain to my aunt exactly why they'd done it." The jazz quartet reached the end of something and held a note a beat too long before resolving it. "And you stayed," Garrett said. Not a judgment, a question asked gently without the inflection that would have made it an accusation. "I was 13. She let the math of that sit between them. "Then I was 14. Then I was 19 and I had a library job and a savings account, and I was still telling myself I'd leave when the moment was right, and the moment kept not being right. And then Vivian announced her engagement, and Constance said I was expected to attend because it would look worse if I didn't than if I did, and—" She stopped, exhaled once. "Here I am." Here she was. Garrett thought about the word brave and what it actually meant when you stripped away the versions that were clean and decisive. The messy version of bravery was staying in the room when every instinct said leave. Staying in the room for 10 years because leaving required a form of certainty that grief and isolation methodically strip away. He knew something about that. He hadn't done it for 10 years, and he hadn't done it at 13. But he knew something about the room. Constance Aldridge arrived at the table. She did not arrive the way people arrive when they are uncertain of their authority. She arrived the way weather arrives, not asking whether the space is available, simply occupying it. Her eyes swept the table, catalogued its occupants, and came to rest on Nora with an expression that had been engineered to resemble parental concern and was doing a reasonable job of it from a distance. Nora. Her voice was perfectly modulated, warm on the surface, with an undertow she didn't bother to conceal from people who already knew it was there. "I see you found different seating." "She's sitting with us." Garrett's voice was easy and entirely final. Constance pivoted her attention to him with the smooth efficiency of a security system tracking movement. "I don't believe we've met. Garrett Holt. I work with Thomas." He held out his hand. After a half-second's beat, she took it. Her grip was the grip of a woman who had been underestimated by handshakers for 30 years and had stopped tolerating it. "I invited Nora to join our table. I hope that's not an inconvenience." Something moved behind Constance's eyes, a rapid recalculation that didn't reach her face. "Of course not." She turned back to Nora, and the register shifted, the warmth drained out like water through a cracked vessel. "We'll speak later." She left. Warren, who had stopped a few feet back, gave Garrett a look that was intended to communicate something territorial, and then followed his wife back toward the center of the room. Garrett turned to find Nora watching him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. She's going to make it worse later." "Probably." He picked up his champagne flute. "Are you staying at the table?" A silence during which the jazz quartet started something new, slower, more earnest, the kind of melody that snuck up on you from behind. Nora looked at the table she'd crossed the room from. The paper cloth, the folding chair, the dying palm casting its inadequate shadow over a place setting meant for one. Then she looked at the empty seat beside Garrett, the one she currently occupied upholstered at a real table between a man who had walked across a room full of people who had agreed to look away, and a woman who had just asked genuinely about a 7-year-old's debate on the epistemology of wolves. "Yes," Nora said, "I'm staying." And somewhere across the room behind the controlled geometry of Vivian Aldridge's expression, the fear Garrett had caught 3 minutes ago sharpened into something that looked considerably more like panic. Constance Aldridge did not make scenes. This was a point of considerable personal pride. She had navigated 30 years of New England social architecture by understanding that the most effective pressure was the kind that left no visible marks. She operated through suggestion, through implication, through the precise calibration of what was said, in which room, to which person, and she had built a life of extraordinary control on this foundation. So when she reappeared at Garrett's table 20 minutes after her first visit, she came alone without Warren, and she sat in the empty chair on Garrett's left, with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once been asked to leave a room she'd entered. She placed one hand flat on the tablecloth and turned to Garrett with an expression so carefully constructed as maternal concern that it almost held. "Mr. Holt." Her voice was pitched for him alone, the table noise providing cover she used with practiced precision. "I want to be transparent with you because I can see you're a decent man, and I don't think you understand the full picture here." A measured pause. "Nora has a history, attaching herself to men who take an interest in her, men who feel sympathy, who mistake her situation for something simpler than it is. Her therapist has spoken with us about it at length. We've tried to get her appropriate support, but she resists it." Another pause, this one weighted with the specific sadness of a woman who has tried everything. "I'm not asking you to be unkind to her. I'm asking you to be careful." Garrett did not look at Constance while she spoke. He looked at Nora, who was engaged in conversation with Margaret 3 seats down, not leaning in, not performing, sitting with her right hand resting on the table, and her attention genuinely on what Margaret was saying. She had just made a small gesture with her wrist that indicated something about the scale of a book, and Margaret had laughed a real laugh, the kind that surprised the person producing it. When Constance finished, Garrett turned to her. He took his time doing it. "She hasn't told me anything about herself." His voice matched her register, quiet, conversational, carrying no heat. "She's been sitting at this table for 20 minutes talking to my colleague about children's books. That's the full extent of what I've observed." He held Constance's gaze without aggression and without apology. "What I also observed earlier this evening was a 22-year-old woman being seated alone at a folding table behind a plant at her own sister's wedding. I didn't need her history to have a reaction to that." Something moved through Constance's expression, a rapid sequence that lasted less than a second, cycling through surprise, reassessment, and the particular cold focus of someone reclassifying a situation. She had expected him to be manageable. The recalculation was visible in the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth. "You don't understand this family," she said. "I didn't feel sorry for her." Garrett picked up his water glass. "I felt sorry for all of you." Constance left the table without another word, and the manner of her leaving, unhurried, upright, generating no scene, was the most precise indicator yet of how seriously she was taking the evening's development. Warren found his way to the table 20 minutes later, and Warren's approach was the opposite of his wife's in every mechanical sense. He was louder and slower, and carried the cumulative looseness of a man 3 drinks past the point where looseness becomes liability. He put one hand on the back of Nora's chair without touching her, a territorial gesture aimed at the table generally, and addressed the group with the expansive warmth of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him. "I want you all to know," Warren began, projecting with the confidence of a man who had given many toasts and received applause for all of them, "that this family has done everything for this young woman, when she had no one, when she had nowhere to go. We opened our home." He spread his free hand in a gesture that encompassed his own generosity. "We clothed her, fed her, put her through school, community college, but still." He produced a short laugh that expected company and didn't receive any. "Some people just can't find a way to be grateful no matter what you give them." The table had gone very quiet. Margaret's expression had arranged itself into something carefully neutral. James had set down his fork. Nora's voice, when it came, arrived without volume and without tremor, which made it more audible somehow than if she had raised it. "You gave me a room without windows, Warren, while Vivian had a balcony." The sentence landed in the silence between musical sets with the particular resonance of a thing said for the first time after years of not being said, not an accusation delivered in anger, but a fact delivered in absolute sobriety, which is a different and more devastating instrument. Warren's expansive warmth curdled. 3 tables away, someone had stopped talking. Then someone at the next table over. The music had reached a natural pause between pieces, and in that pause Nora's words had carried, and the carrying had consequences. Garrett watched the radius of silence expand outward from their table like rings in disturbed water, reaching far enough that when Harriet Pruitt began moving through the crowd toward them, 83 years old, Walker preceding her by a step, black dress expression of someone who had outlived every reason to be tactful, she was moving through an audience that was already listening. Harriet Pruitt was the groom's maternal grandmother, a woman who had taught 8th grade history in central New Hampshire for 31 years, and had developed in that time a working theory that most human cruelty reduced to the same origin, the decision to treat other people's pain as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a reality to be acknowledged. She had watched the evening unfold from her table near the head of the room, with the patient attention of someone who has seen this particular play performed before and is waiting for the part where the scaffolding comes down. She stopped at the edge of Garrett's table, planted her walker, and held up her phone with the certainty of someone producing evidence at a proceeding she had been waiting years to attend. "I'm going to read something." Her voice required no amplification. From the Concord Monitor, November 2014. Aldridge Industries CEO Warren Aldridge opened his heart and home this week to Nora Calloway, 12, who lost both parents and her left arm in a tragic accident last month. She lowered the phone with the timing of a woman who had spent 31 years managing a room. The adoption, Aldridge said, was a reminder of what truly matters. Another pause. That article ran on a Thursday. The piece that ran the previous Tuesday was about the 300 Aldridge Industries employees who'd lost their jobs in a single quarter. Funny, the timing. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely, not the absence of sound, but the presence of understanding arriving simultaneously in enough people that the collective intake of breath was almost audible. Warren's color had moved through red into something approaching purple. Constance, who had materialized at the edge of the gathering with the silent efficiency of someone who had been monitoring developments from a distance, stepped forward and placed a hand on her husband's arm, not a supportive gesture, but a restraining one. "This is a private family matter." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to closing conversations. "I'd ask our guests to respect that." Harriet Pruitt looked at Constance with the expression of a woman who has encountered this argument before and found it wanting every time. The child was seated behind a plant. Constance. At her own family's table she got a paper cloth and a folding chair. "I've been to better appointed church potlucks." She turned her attention to Nora, and her voice changed, not softer exactly, but differently weighted. "You don't have to sit quietly through this, sweetheart. You haven't had to for a while. You just haven't had anyone in the room who said so." Nora had not moved through any of this. She sat with her hand flat on the table and her eyes on Harriet with an expression Garrett couldn't fully read, not gratitude, not relief, but something more fundamental than either. The expression of a person receiving external confirmation of something they had held privately for years with no corroboration, which is an entirely different experience from simply being agreed with. Then Vivian arrived. She had been across the room when Harriet began speaking and had covered the distance with the swift efficiency of someone managing a crisis, her dress accommodating the pace better than it had any right to. She stopped at the edge of the gathering, took in the tableau. Harriet with her phone, Warren with his purple face, Constance with her restraining hand, Nora at the center of it all, and made a choice that no one at the table had predicted. She did not go to her parents. She positioned herself at the perimeter of the crowd where enough people could see her, and when she spoke, it was to the assembled guests rather than to any individual. I watched what happened in this family for 10 years. Her voice had dropped the performative warmth of wedding reception. Vivian. What remained was flatter and more honest, the voice of someone finally setting down something heavy. I watched it and I said nothing. Every dinner she missed, every introduction where my mother described her as our charity project. Every year Nora found another reason to stay that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with having nowhere else to go. A pause during which she did not look at Nora. That's not a confession that's meant to make me feel better. It's just true. I said nothing. That's on me. Then she turned and walked out of the reception hall, her dress trailing behind her with a sound like a closing argument, and her new husband stood at the head table watching her go with the expression of a man who had just understood something significant about the woman he had married 8 hours earlier. Warren made a sound, the beginning of something that might have been a denial or might have been an accusation, and Constance's hand on his arm tightened from restraint to something close to a tourniquet. She steered him toward the head table with the inexorable calm of someone managing damage that has already been done, and the crowd parted for them the way crowds part for things they want to watch leave. Harriet Pruitt looked at Garrett. "Good man," she said simply, and moved away with her walker toward the nearest table, where she sat down and accepted a glass of water from a stunned server with the composure of someone who had just checked an item off a long-standing list. The table exhaled. Margaret reached across and touched Nora's hand quickly, gently, and then withdrew it, understanding that the gesture had been received. James poured water into Nora's glass without being asked. Small acts. The room needed them. Garrett looked at Nora. She was looking at the head table where the Aldridges had reassembled into their rigid formation. Warren's glass already refilled Constance's posture, communicating the specific message of people who have decided the only remaining move is to outlast the room. The ice sculpture of 2 swans at the center of the hall had begun to melt at the edges imperceptibly, but the process was underway and could not be reversed. "Are you all right?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved rather than deflecting it. "I don't know yet." A pause. "I think I might be. For the first time in a while, I think I actually might be." The jazz quartet resumed something up-tempo and deliberately cheerful, the musicians earning their fee by providing normalcy on demand. Conversations around the room gradually restarted, and the gathering reorganized itself into the shape of a wedding reception through the sheer collective determination of 200 people who had paid for salmon and dancing and preferred to have both. The Aldridges remained at the head table. Vivian did not return. Garrett stayed at his table until the final hour of the reception, and what surprised him, what he would turn over later, driving home through the dark of central New Hampshire, on the interstate Wren's photograph on the passenger seat, because he'd taken it out of his pocket and set it there. With the specific intention of having company for the drive was how the evening had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. People he didn't know stopped by the table, not to gawk, not to collect details for later distribution, but with the particular quality of movement that happens when something true has been said publicly and people want to be near the truth rather than far from it. A woman in her 60s touched Nora's shoulder briefly and said without preamble, they made their housekeeper's daughter wait outside during every birthday party Vivian had, for 11 years. I never said anything either. She moved on. A man Garrett recognized from the ceremony but whose name he didn't know stopped and told Nora that Warren had fired his brother-in-law 2 weeks before Christmas without severance and then bought a boat the following spring. These were not comforting stories. They were the specific testimony of a community that had been accumulating evidence for years and had just found a courtroom. Nora received each account with the attention of someone who understood that the people sharing them needed to share them as much as she needed to hear them. That shame held privately over long years requires a witness to begin its transformation into something less corrosive. Garrett watched this and understood that what he had done by walking across the room had not been a rescue. It had been a door opened in the right place at the right time, and Nora had walked through it entirely under her own power. They exchanged numbers before he left, a practical exchange conducted without ceremony. She wrote her number in his phone with her right hand while he held it, neither of them attaching significance to the gesture aloud, both of them aware the significance was there regardless. He told her to call if she needed anything. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had spent years distinguishing between words that meant what they claimed to mean and words that didn't, and nodded once, which was its own kind of answer. He drove the 2 hours back to Hartford through the specific dark of a New Hampshire September night, the highway cutting through stands of pine that absorbed the headlights without reflecting them, the sky above carrying more stars than were visible from the city, the kind of night that reminded you the world was larger than the rooms you spent most of your time in. He thought about Wren's voice that morning. He thought about the reception and the ice sculpture losing its edges. He thought about Nora's face when she said she thought she might actually be all right, and the way that sentence had sounded careful and new, like the first use of a word you've understood theoretically but never had occasion to apply. He put the photograph of Diane back in his pocket before he pulled into the Hartford driveway. The call came the next morning at 6:47. He was on his second cup of coffee at the kitchen counter in yesterday's dress shirt when his phone lit up with a number 12 hours old in his contacts. Her voice was steady in a way that cost something. She called this morning, Constance, 30 days to vacate. A brief pause. I've been expecting it for 2 years, so it's not a surprise. I just wanted someone to know. A smaller pause. I'm not sure why I called you specifically. Garrett set down his coffee cup. I'm glad you did. The silence that followed was not empty. It carried the specific texture of someone conducting an internal negotiation between the part that had reached out and the part now reconsidering the reach. He waited without filling it. I have money. Her voice shifted, something entering it that had the quality of something hard-won and carefully maintained. I want you to know that. $8,000. 4 years of library wages. I'm not calling because I need rescuing. I know you're not. There's a woman at work with a basement apartment she's been trying to sublet. I've already looked into it. The lease terms are reasonable. She delivered this information in the tone of someone demonstrating the calculation behind the call, making clear the call was not the calculation but something else, something without a clean, practical name. I have options. I know you do. Garrett looked at the kitchen, the crayon drawing Wren had taped to the cabinet door, the uneven row of coffee mugs, the east-facing window over the sink that received good morning light he was currently failing to appreciate because he was looking at his phone. The kitchen had 4 chairs around a table that 2 people used. We have a spare room. Wren would like the company. So would I. He let a beat settle before the next part because the next part needed to land correctly. You don't have to. But I'd like you to. The silence this time had a different quality, not stalling but shifting the sound of something being reconsidered from a new angle. I don't understand why you keep doing this, she said. She didn't sound suspicious. She sounded like someone asking a question whose answer would change something load-bearing. Garrett looked at the photograph of Diane he'd set on the counter when he came in last night, still there in the morning light. The laugh he could no longer remember the cause of. The summer catching the side of her face. Because you put your hand in my arm last night and walked across a room full of people who had decided you were invisible, and you did it like you'd just decided to stop agreeing with them. He picked up his coffee cup. That seemed worth showing up for. Another silence. Then, with the quality of something said by a person stepping through a door they've been standing outside of for a long time. Okay. 1 word. The kind that rearranges things. He picked Nora up from the Aldridge house 10 days later, not the full 30 because she had packed what needed packing in an afternoon, and saw no reason to remain in a place that had issued her notice simply to demonstrate that she could outlast the discomfort. She was waiting on the front steps when he pulled up 2 suitcases and a backpack arranged beside her with the efficient minimalism of someone who had long ago stopped acquiring things that couldn't follow her out the door. Constance watched from an upstairs window. Garrett saw the curtain. He didn't look up a second time. He carried the suitcases to the car. When he opened the passenger door for Nora and she got in, he noticed she didn't look back at the house, not once, not from the seat, not as they pulled away, not when they reached the end of the drive and turned onto the road that would take them to the interstate and south toward Hartford. She faced forward with the settled attention of someone whose business with a place was genuinely concluded, not suppressed, not deferred, but done. They drove for 20 minutes in a quiet that had graduated from the careful silence of two people still learning each other's edges into something more comfortable, the kind of quiet that doesn't require management. Then Nora said, without looking away from the road ahead, "Thank you. Not just for the room, for last night, for—" She stopped, reorganizing. "For understanding that standing next to someone while things happen to them is different from doing something to help them, and knowing which one I needed." Garrett kept his eyes on the interstate, the pines giving way to the broader landscape of southern New Hampshire, rolling toward the Connecticut state line. "You did the hard part." "I said one sentence." "The sentence you'd been not saying for 10 years. He glanced at her briefly. "That's not small." She turned to look at him. Then, not the assessing look of their first conversation, not the careful measurement of someone deciding how much to trust. Something quieter and more direct. The look of someone who has decided on the basis of accumulated evidence that the person beside them is what they appear to be, which is rarer than it sounds and worth acknowledging when it occurs. Neither of them said anything else for the remainder of the drive. The quiet between them had the specific quality of something new that had found its proper weight, not heavy, not absent, but present in the way that things are present when they belong where they are. They crossed into Connecticut as the morning light went from early to full, the kind of clear September light that makes distances look achievable. And when Hartford's skyline appeared on the horizon, Garrett found himself noticing it differently than he had on 100 previous approaches, not as an endpoint, but as a place that was waiting, which was a distinction that had not occurred to him before, and that he suspected would continue to matter. The spare room had a window that faced the backyard, and Nora stood in it on the first morning with her coffee, watching the light move across the overgrown grass in the specific way that light moves when there is no one curating its passage freely, without agenda, touching everything equally. The yard had been maintained by someone who cared, and then left unmaintained by someone who had run out of bandwidth for caring, and she recognized the description because it extended, she suspected, well beyond the yard. Garrett had carried her 2 suitcases and 1 backpack upstairs the previous night, with the careful efficiency of a man determined not to make the moment feel larger than she needed it to be. She had told him not to apologize for the room. He had apologized anyway, briefly, for the curtain rod that listed slightly to the left, and she had looked at the window. The actual window, the fact of it, the rectangle of evidence that the world extended past the walls and that she was permitted to look at it, and understood that no apology was necessary or possible for something this sufficient. She had not had a window in her room at the Aldrich house. This was not a metaphor she was constructing after the fact. It was an architectural fact she had lived with for 10 years, a room on the interior of the 2nd floor that received light only when the hallway door was open, which Constance preferred it not to be, because the sight of Nora moving through the house reminded guests that the house contained a person whose presence required explanation. A window was not a luxury. A window was proof. She stood in the proof for 20 minutes before she heard Wren's voice downstairs and went to meet the day. Wren arrived home from her grandmother's that afternoon in a state of concentrated excitement that expressed itself as a thorough house tour delivered at the pace of someone who has been waiting to give it. She showed Nora every room with the proprietary authority of a 7-year-old docent, the couch spring on the left side that required foreknowledge, the kitchen drawer that needed a simultaneous lift and pull to open the showerhead's 30-second cold delay before it committed to warmth. She delivered all of this as essential intelligence for living in the house which it was, and Nora received it as such, asking 2 follow-up questions about the drawer that Wren answered with the satisfaction of someone whose expertise has been taken seriously. In the kitchen, Wren retrieved a painted tin recipe box from a low cabinet and set it on the counter with the particular reverence of a child handling an object whose importance she understood without being able to fully articulate. The paint was worn at the corners down to bare metal, the lid requiring a specific pressure at a specific angle to open. "These are Mommy's recipes," Wren said. "Daddy tries some of them, but sometimes it makes him sad and he has to stop." She looked at the box with the settled expression of someone who has processed a significant loss as completely as 7 years permits, and arrived at a relationship with the facts that is neither denial nor devastation. Maybe you could cook some, if you wanted. You don't have to. That evening after Wren was in bed and the house had found its nighttime register, the second-floor hallway creaking once as the temperature dropped, the refrigerator cycling through its reliable hum, Nora opened the recipe box at the kitchen counter. Diane Holt had written in a slanted, confident hand, blue ink on index cards, her recipes organized by season rather than by course or ingredient, a logic that was idiosyncratic and completely coherent once you understood it. The winter section was the heaviest, its cards worn soft from repeated handling. The summer section had amendments in the margins and additions tucked between cards on folded scraps of paper, a system that had been actively revised by someone who cooked the same things many times and kept finding ways to improve them. The last item in the box was not a recipe. A piece of notepaper folded once, tucked behind the final seasonal divider with the deliberateness of something placed rather than filed. Nora almost missed it. Her fingers found it by the slight difference in paper weight. She unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that belongs to someone else, with the awareness that you are reading across a boundary. If you're reading this without me, it means Wren finally convinced you to actually use this kitchen instead of just making coffee in it. Good. This is where we lived, Garrett, not in the living room, not at the dining table, but in here with something on the stove and Wren on the step stool stirring things she was too young to stir. Don't let it become a museum. Whoever is standing in this kitchen now, let them cook. Let them stay. She stood at the counter for a long moment with the note in her hand. Garrett's footsteps on the stairs he had been giving her the evening, making himself scarce with the consideration of someone who understood that arrival in a new space required room to breathe without an audience. When he came into the kitchen, she held the note out without preamble or explanation, because no preamble or explanation was adequate to what it was. He took it, read it. She turned to the recipe box and busied herself with the cards, giving him the privacy of her back, and when the quality of the silence behind her changed, she turned around. He was sitting at this kitchen table with the note flat under one hand, looking at it with the expression of someone continuing a conversation with someone who can no longer hold their side of it. Which is still a conversation, still contains something that functions as response, still matters in the specific way that things matter when they are the only form of contact remaining. His face had the open, unguarded quality of a person who has been caught by something true and has decided not to manage it. "She would have liked you," he said. His voice had the careful texture of a wound that is real and present and not being performed for anyone's benefit. Not in the polite sense. She had a specific category for people who survived things without losing their shape. Nora looked at the note under his hand, at Diane's slanted blue ink, at the instruction written to a specific person that had somehow arrived at the right kitchen at the right time for a different person entirely. "She told you to let me stay before she knew I was coming." She was like that. Something in his face settled into a different arrangement, the way a room settles after a door is opened and the pressure equalizes. Ahead of the situation. They stayed in the kitchen until midnight, talking in the sideways manner of people conducting a real conversation under the practical cover of another one. Nora working through the recipe cards in seasonal order, Garrett making coffee. Neither of them particularly needed both of them, leaving thoughts visible rather than edited before delivery. She told him about the Tuesday reading group, specifically about a 9-year-old named Marcus, who had spent an entire session arguing that the ending of a picture book was wrong and the author had made a mistake, and who had been. Nora thought probably correct. Garrett told her about Wren's most recent theory, which was that the reason thunder came after lightning was that the sky needed time to decide whether it wanted to say anything about what had just happened. They talked about small things that contained large things, which is the only honest available method for talking about large things, when you are still learning the exact coordinates of another person, their specific tolerances, the particular shape of their silences, the difference between the pauses that mean they are finished and the ones that mean they are continuing. Outside the kitchen window, the yard was dark, past the reach of the interior light. The overgrown grass, invisible, the space it occupied simply a depth of shadow that could have been anything or nothing. Nora found herself thinking about the room without windows in the Aldridge house, and understanding in a way she hadn't been able to articulate while she was living it what the absence had actually cost. Not the light, the evidence, the daily confirmation that the world extended past the walls and that her existence within them was not the totality of what was possible. She had spent 10 years in a room without that confirmation. She had a window now. She intended to use it every morning for as long as the arrangement held, and she was beginning cautiously and without yet trusting the caution to suspect the arrangement might hold for a long time. The consequences for the Aldridge family did not arrive as a single dramatic reckoning, but accumulated in the manner of structural failures, generally progressively, each element bearing the load transferred from the previous one until the load could no longer be redistributed. Warren faced his board of directors 6 weeks after the wedding in a meeting convened around a quarterly shortfall and 2 clients whose contract renewals had been notably brief. But the meeting's actual atmosphere was determined by the reputation damage that had moved through professional circles in central New Hampshire with the efficient underground velocity of information that people feel simultaneously compelled to share and slightly guilty about sharing. The board voted to request his resignation by a margin that indicated the wedding had not been the cause, but had been the moment when pre-existing reservations reached the density required for action. Warren complied, which surprised the people who had expected him to fight. They had not fully accounted for how much of his authority had been borrowed from an image that had been substantially revised. Constance was asked to step down from 3 charitable organization boards in the 2 months following. Never fired. Always asked in the careful language that institutions use when they prefer the appearance of consensus to the reality of enforcement. Nora learned this through Margaret, who had lived in the same county for 40 years and understood that information shared carefully travels exactly as far as it needs to. Nora received the news without the satisfaction she might have expected to feel. What was there instead was something quieter, closer to the specific relief of setting down a weight you carried so long you had forgotten its mass was not your own. Vivian sent a text in February, 4 months after the wedding. One sentence, "I'm sorry I put your name on that table." Nora read it on her lunch break at the library, set the phone face down on the desk, finished her sandwich and thought about it for the remainder of the afternoon without resolution. Before she locked up for the day, she picked up the phone and typed, "I know." She sent it. She did not block the number. She did not hear from Constance. The decision about graduate school was Nora's alone, made on a Tuesday morning in November, while she was reshelving the periodicals section before the library opened in the specific quality of early morning quiet that belongs to public buildings before the public arrives. She had been thinking about it for 2 years, the University of Connecticut's social work program, the particular kind of work it would authorize her to do, the specific population she wanted to serve, children, in the situation she had been in, placed in households that had accepted them for reasons that had nothing to do with love, navigating the administrative structures of care without anyone inside those structures who understood from the inside what the navigation actually cost. She had researched the program, calculated the finances, identified the scholarship application, and then set it aside 11 times over 2 years for reasons that were ultimately all variations of the same reason she had not yet been certain enough of her own continuity to make a plan that extended 5 years into the future. Standing in the periodicals section on a Tuesday morning in November, she understood that she was certain enough now. She did not discuss it with Garrett before she acted. She applied, submitted her financial aid forms, and contacted the scholarship office directly, and only then, over dinner that evening, mentioned it to Garrett and Wren, with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone reporting a decision already in motion rather than requesting input on one still forming. Garrett looked at her across the table. "When did you submit?" "This afternoon." "You didn't say anything." "I'm saying something now." She met his eyes. "I needed to do it myself first. To know I did it myself." He held her gaze for a moment, and in that moment she could see him understanding the distinction, not the practical distinction between doing something alone versus with support, but the specific and necessary distinction between a life where your decisions are made by other people and presented to you as facts, and a life where you make your own decisions and present them to the people you love as accomplished things. He nodded. It was a real nod. "Tell me about the program," she told him. Wren listened from across the table with the focused attention she brought to anything she considered important, asked one clarifying question about what a social worker actually did on a Tuesday, and upon receiving a detailed answer pronounced the career choice reasonable and returned to her dinner. It was the most affirming professional evaluation Nora had ever received. The application to the University of Connecticut's social work program required 3 letters of recommendation. Her library supervisor wrote with the efficient warmth of 4 years of watching the work be done. The school liaison from the Tuesday reading group wrote about the specific patience required for 7 children with 7 different relationships to language and story, and the way Nora had understood that the children arguing loudest about the wolf were the ones who needed the most careful attention to the question underneath the argument. The 3rd letter Nora requested herself directly by calling Harriet Pruitt at her daughter's house in Nashua on a Wednesday afternoon and asking. Harriet was quiet for a moment after the request. Then, "I was wondering when you'd call." She wrote 4 pages in a hand still precise at 83, covering Nora's character with the detail of an eyewitness account and referencing the September wedding without euphemism, without softening, and without apology. One passage I watched this young woman conduct herself with more dignity under deliberate humiliation than most people manage under ordinary difficulty. "I have been in the business of observing human character for 83 years. I know what it looks like when someone has refused against sustained and organized opposition to be diminished. This is what it looks like. Put her in your program." The acceptance letter came on a Thursday in March, 6 months after the wedding, arriving in the afternoon mail, while Nora was still at the library. She found it on the kitchen counter when she got home. Wren had collected the mail, identified the university's return address, and placed the envelope in the center of the counter with the precise positioning of someone creating a moment rather than simply handling correspondence. Nora read the letter 3 times. Wren, who had been doing homework at the table with the specific quality of attention that is actually surveillance, looked up after the 3rd reading. "Is it good?" "It's good." Wren disappeared for 10 minutes and returned with a piece of poster board covered in green letters. "Congratulations, Aunt Nora." The word "aunt" underlined twice with increasing force, the letters improving from left to right as her hand found its rhythm. She hung it across the kitchen doorway with tape applied at irregular intervals and stood back to assess the result with the satisfaction of someone whose work communicates its intended meaning. Garrett ordered pizza. They sat at the kitchen table, all 3, the banner slightly crooked above them, crooked in the specific way that handmade things are crooked, which is different from the way broken things are crooked. Wren distributing napkins with executive efficiency and explaining at length why cheese was better distributed by hand than by knife, a position she supported with more evidence than the position strictly required. Nora looked at the banner and at the table and at Wren, who had sauce on her chin and absolute conviction in her cheese methodology, and felt something arrive that she did not have a ready name for because she had not previously needed the name. Not happiness. Only happiness was a component, but not the whole. The whole was the specific sensation of occupying the exact right place at the exact right moment, with no part of herself measuring the distance to the nearest exit, with no interior voice cataloging the conditions under which this would be revoked, with nothing held in reserve against the possibility that the bottom was about to fall out. She was simply there entirely in a kitchen with a crooked banner and a pizza box and a 7-year-old conducting a seminar on dairy application. She cried into her root beer. Wren passed the napkins without comment, which was the most sophisticated emotional intelligence available in the room. That night, after Wren was in bed and the kitchen had been restored to its ordinary state, Nora found Garrett on the back porch. He had a mug of something and was looking at the yard, which was visible now by the light coming through the kitchen window, the grass still imperfect, the garden beds still in the early stages of being reclaimed from years of minimal attention. She sat beside him on the step, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he didn't move to create distance. Neither did she. For a while neither of them spoke, and the silence had the quality that silences acquire when both people in them have decided the silence is sufficient and are not filling it out of discomfort, but simply inhabiting it. "I called Harriet Pruitt myself." Nora said finally. "For the recommendation letter. I didn't ask you to reach out to her first." "I know. She told me." A pause. "She seemed pleased you called." "She said she'd been waiting for me to." Nora wrapped both hands around an imaginary mug, a habitual gesture that her body made regardless of whether she was holding anything. "I've been thinking about why it took this long. To do things myself. To not wait for someone to tell me I was allowed." She looked at the yard. "I think I spent so long in a house where every action required pre-authorization that I forgot authorization was something I could give myself." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "And now I applied to graduate school on a Tuesday morning without telling anyone first." She paused. It felt like jumping off something, in the good way. He turned to look at her then, with the particular quality of attention that was not assessment. He had stopped assessing her somewhere in the first weeks she had noticed the way you notice when a door that was always slightly ajar is finally fully open. It was the look of someone who has already decided and is now simply present with the decision. "I owe you something," she said. "You don't owe me anything. Not a debt, a truth." She turned to face him. The porch light caught the side of his face the way the summer light in the photograph caught the side of Diane's. The same quality of ordinary illumination making something visible that was there all the time. "I have been in this house for 6 months, and I have been very careful about what I let myself feel about being in this house because careful is what I know how to be, and because I was not certain that what I was feeling was what I thought it was, versus what I wanted it to be." She held his gaze. "I am now certain." Garrett set down his mug. He did not say anything for a moment. Not the silence of someone composing a response, but the silence of someone receiving something that requires time to fully arrive. "I've been certain for a while," he said finally. "I kept waiting for the right moment to say so, and then I realized I was doing the thing I've been doing for 3 years, which is treating the absence of the perfect moment as a reason not to act." The yard was very quiet. Somewhere down the street a neighbor's porch light went on and off again. "Diane would not have waited," Nora said. "No." The corner of his mouth moved. "She would have said something in the car on the way home from New Hampshire and been annoyed at me for not saying it first." They sat with that for a moment with Diane, who was present in this house in the recipe cards and in the photograph and in the daughter asleep upstairs and in the note that had been written to one person and received by another, which was perhaps the most precise possible description of how love actually travels through time. "I love you," Nora said. She said it with the directness of someone delivering information because it was information specific, accurate, the result of 6 months of evidence assessed with the care she applied to everything. "I want you to know that I know what I'm saying. I'm not saying it because I'm grateful or because I'm afraid of what happens if I don't. I'm saying it because it's true." Garrett took her hand, her right hand, her only hand, held in both of his, with the same deliberateness he would bring to the ceremony in the backyard 6 months later. "I love you," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to say it without making you feel like you had to say it back. I don't do things I don't want to do anymore." She turned her hand in his. "I'm working on it." He laughed, a real one, the kind that caught him slightly by surprise, and she felt the sound of it as something physical, a vibration against her shoulder where they were still touching warm in the September night air. They stayed on the porch until the neighbor's light came back on and then went off again, and the yard was dark, and the house was quiet, and Garrett's mug had long since gone cold, and neither of them mentioned going inside for a while longer. Spring arrived in the manner of Connecticut springs tentatively, and then all at once the yard going from gray to the specific optimistic green of things that have been waiting underground. Garrett started on the garden beds in April, working on weekend mornings in the incremental way of someone who has a long-term project and is content with the pace. Nora began her social work coursework in September, commuting to the Yukon campus on Tuesdays and Thursdays, studying in the evenings after Wren was in bed reading case files and policy documents and developmental psychology with the focused attention of someone who has been preparing for a subject for 22 years without knowing that was what they were doing. The mistake came in that same spring on a Wednesday evening when Garrett came home from work and mentioned in the casual tone of someone reporting a practical matter already handled that he had called the landlord of the Wellington Street apartment Nora had mentioned 2 weeks prior as one of several options she'd been researching, called to understand the lease terms, he said, because he thought it might be useful to have the information. Nora set down the book she was reading. The gesture was careful, not dramatic, the careful of someone placing a thing down deliberately rather than dropping it. "Did you call the Wellington Street landlord?" "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." He had heard it in his own voice when he said it, the specific register of a person who understood, as the words were arriving, that they described something done wrong. She was quiet for a moment that had a particular density. Not anger, or not only anger, but the compression of something much older and more fundamental than this specific Wednesday evening. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it completely." Her voice stayed even. Evenness, she had learned, was not the absence of feeling, but a form of precision, the decision to make the content of a statement legible rather than obscured by the emotion carrying it. "I spent 10 years in a house where my circumstances were decided by other people and presented to me as facts I was expected to receive with gratitude. I know the difference between that and what you did. I know you are not them, and I know you meant nothing by it except helpfulness. But the mechanism is the same mechanism. The experience of having a decision made about my life without my input is the same experience regardless of the intent behind it, and that experience is the one thing I cannot afford to normalize again." She held his gaze steadily. "Do you understand the difference between why what they did was wrong and why what you did was also wrong, even though they are not the same wrongness?" Garrett set down what he was holding. He did not contextualize or explain or redirect toward his intentions because he understood with sufficient clarity that intentions were not the subject. The subject was the action and what it had replicated in the body of a person for whom that replication had a specific and non-abstract cost. "I understand," he said. "I'm sorry. I won't do it again." She assessed the apology with the attention she brought to everything that mattered, looking for substance beneath the surface rather than surface arranged to resemble substance. She found the real thing. The held density in her posture lowered slowly like pressure releasing through a careful valve. "Thank you." They ate dinner. The conversation moved on, not because the moment had been resolved in the sense of being filed and completed, but because some conversations need to breathe after they've been had rather than be immediately concluded, and both of them were learning imperfectly, incrementally, in the manner of people who are serious about getting it right, what the structure they were building could bear, and where its actual load-bearing walls were located. They were better for having had it. That was the truth about honest friction. It revealed the structure which was more valuable than comfort, even in the moments when comfort was what the body wanted. The wedding took place in September, 1 year after the Aldridge reception in the backyard that had been overgrown when Nora arrived and was now something different, not manicured, not performed, but intentional. The garden beds restored and the grass properly kept, and the old fence repainted by Wren over 2 weekends in a project she had proposed and managed herself. Margaret arrived 2 days prior with a truck of dahlias and the organizational authority of someone who had survived her own daughter's wedding and retained comprehensive institutional knowledge about exactly where these events went sideways and how to prevent it. String lights ran from the porch eaves to the fence line. Chairs upholstered, rented, not folding, arranged in 2 sections of 12 on either side of a strip of grass that functioned as an aisle. Wren wore deep rose, a color selected over 3 separate shopping trips, with a specificity of vision that had not admitted compromise at any point in the process. She distributed rose petals with the solemn focus of someone performing a ceremonial function, dropped the rings twice, once during the rehearsal, once during the actual ceremony, and recovered both times without breaking stride, which everyone agreed afterward was in fact more affecting than a flawless performance would have been. Margaret officiated in a green dress and her good earrings, having gotten ordained online 6 weeks prior, with the purposeful efficiency of someone who had identified a task commensurate with her particular skill set, and cried from her opening sentence, which she had told Garrett in advance was going to happen, and that he should not interpret as a loss of composure, but as an accurate response to the situation. On the side table where food would be served, a single place card leaned against an empty glass. The name on it was Diane. No chair, no place setting, just the card and the glass, and a small cluster of dahlias cut from the yard in the same deep rows as Wren's dress, because Wren had raised this at breakfast 3 weeks earlier, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone for whom the dead remained participants rather than becoming absences. Mommy should have a spot, not a seat. She's not going to sit down, but a spot so she knows she's part of it. Nora had looked at Garrett across the breakfast table, and Garrett had looked at Nora, and neither of them had had anything to add to Wren's theology, which had the completeness that the theologies of 7-year-olds sometimes achieve not in spite of their simplicity, but because of it. Harriet Pruitt attended, driven up from Nashua by her grandson, and sat in the front row with the particular satisfaction of someone present at an outcome they had a small hand in and are too honest to overclaim credit for. She wore black as she wore to all significant occasions on the grounds that black was appropriate to both weddings and funerals, both being moments when one thing ended and another began. When Garrett took Nora's hand during the exchange of vows, her right hand, her only hand, held in both of his with the deliberateness of a man making unambiguously clear that this was not an accommodation of a deficit, but a choice made about a specific hand belonging to a specific person. Wren threw an entire double handful of remaining petals from approximately 4 feet away, with the enthusiastic precision of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment and was not going to underdeliver. Several petals landed in Margaret's hair. Margaret did not discover this until the photographs were reviewed 3 days later, at which point she declared it an improvement. The photographs were slightly chaotic in the specific way that photographs are chaotic when the people in them are genuinely present rather than performing presence. They were perfect. 6 years after the wedding, a 7-year-old named Owen came to them through the state foster system. He arrived in October with 2 garbage bags of belongings and the specific wariness of a child who has learned that every new environment is a temporary environment, until proven otherwise by a duration of evidence he had not yet encountered. He assessed rooms before entering them. He answered questions with the minimum number of words required. He watched adults for early indications of the pattern, the initial warmth, the gradual qualification of the warmth, the eventual withdrawal, with the vigilance of someone who has been taught by experience that the pattern is inevitable and that the only variable is how quickly it arrives. Nora recognized the architecture of it because she had lived in a version of it. She did not attempt to dismantle it directly because she understood that trust of this kind does not unbuild under pressure. It unbuilds the same way it builds through the slow accumulation of evidence that the environment is stable and that the people in it mean what they appear to mean. She provided the evidence. Garrett provided it. Wren, 14 years old and home from a school trip when Owen first arrived, shook his hand with the gravity of someone conducting a formal introduction and told him about the couch spring, the kitchen drawer, and the shower head. Delay the same briefing she had given Nora 7 years earlier, and Owen received the information with the absolute attention of someone for whom practical knowledge about a new environment is a form of safety. It was the beginning of something which is the most that can be said about beginnings while they are still beginning. 2 years after Owen arrived, Nora, 32, and finishing her 2nd year of casework. Garrett, 45, and recently promoted, Wren, 13, and conducting an ongoing correspondence with Harriet Pruitt about the ethics of historical revisionism. Clara was born in July. They had decided together over several conversations across the late winter and early spring, with the deliberateness of 2 people who had learned to make decisions together rather than around each other. Clara arrived with Garrett's coloring and a quality of presence that announced itself within the first hours, a stubbornness that the nurses called alertness, and that the family would come to understand as the productive kind, the kind organized around a clear and internally consistent sense of what was right, which is the only kind of stubbornness worth having. Wren held her in the hospital room with the expression of someone conducting a structural assessment, then looked up and said, "She's going to be a lot of work, and I'm going to miss most of it because of school. That's genuinely annoying." She meant that she loved her without reservation. The room understood. Owen, who had been in the waiting area with Margaret and had been brought in to meet his new sister, stood at the edge of the hospital room with his hands in his pockets for a long moment before Nora said from the bed simply, "Come meet Clara." He crossed the room and looked at the baby with an expression that was the most unguarded his face had been in the 2 years she had known him. He did not say anything. He reached out one finger, and Clara, with the absolute authority of a person who has just arrived and is immediately establishing jurisdiction, wrapped her hand around it and held on. Nora watched this and felt her throat tighten with the specific pressure of a feeling that had no cleaner name than this is what it was all for. Not a transaction, not a resolution, not a reward for having survived the years before. Simply the accumulation of choices arriving at a moment that was exactly what it appeared to be. 2 years after Clara was born on a Saturday in June, Wren Holt graduated from high school as valedictorian of a class of 211 students. She was 18. The auditorium was full, the east-facing windows distributing June light across the audience in the partial, uneven way of light that has a direction warming the left side of faces and leaving the right in shadow. Garrett sat in the third row with Nora beside him, their hands in the arrangement that had long since stopped being a deliberate act and become simply the default, his holding hers continuous and unremarked like breathing. Owen sat on Garrett's other side, 11 now, and already showing the beginning of the height that would eventually make him the tallest person in most rooms he entered. His wariness had transformed over the years from defensive to simply the quietness of a person who listens rather than performs listening, who speaks when he has something specific to say, and whose silences are not absences but a different form of presence. Clara was in Nora's lap, 2 years old, oscillating between engagement with the proceedings and engagement with the zipper pull on Nora's jacket, which offered more reliable feedback. When Wren reached the podium, she looked out over the auditorium with the unhurried patience of someone who is not searching for anything because she already knows exactly where everything is. She found her family in the third row. She held the look for a moment, taking them in, all 5 of them, the way you take in something you want to carry with you, before she began. "When I was 7 years old," Wren said, her voice finding the room with the ease of someone who has something to say and trusts the saying of it. "My father went to a wedding and came home with the woman who became my mother. He almost didn't go. I know this because I'm the one who made him promise to be brave that morning, which in retrospect is an unreasonable amount of pressure to apply to a 38-year-old man from someone who was 7 years old and had no real understanding of what brave meant in practice or what it was going to cost him." A pause during which the auditorium offered a laugh that was warmer than polite. "What I did understand was that my dad had been sitting in his seat for a long time. Not literally. He went to work, made dinner, came to every school event, did everything he was supposed to do. But there is a difference between being present, and I had seen enough of both to know which one he had been living in for 3 years. The room settled into the quality of attention that belongs to people who recognize something true arriving. My mother was sitting alone at a table built for one behind a dying plant at the wedding of a family that had decided her presence was useful to them, but not welcome among them. My father saw that. He stood up. He walked across a room full of people who had agreed by consensus and without discussion to look somewhere else. He said 6 words to her. She paused. "Act like you're with me." And he meant them. Which is the only part of the story that actually matters, because words are easy and meaning them all the way forward is not. Meaning them through the morning after and the year after and every inconvenient and imperfect and necessary thing that follows, that is the part that requires something. He meant them all the way forward. That is the whole story. Everything else is what grew from it. Garrett's jaw tightened once and then released. Nora's hand pressed against his. "I became a sister twice after that." Wren's voice carried the deliberate pace of someone who has written something carefully and is now trusting the words to do their work. Once to a kid who receives information and holds it quietly and will be taller than everyone in this room before he's done, and once to a 2-year-old who has already identified being the youngest and the loudest as a fully viable life strategy and who is, I want to note for the record, correct. In the third row, Clara looked up from the zipper at the sound of laughter, apparently satisfied. Owen looked straight ahead. hands on his knees, shoulders set with the particular effort of someone who has made a decision about public composure and is honoring it at some cost. What I learned from all of it from watching my parents build something real, which required honesty and argument and the specific courage of being wrong and saying so without making the other person carry the weight of your having been wrong, is that families are not the product of the right circumstances or the right paperwork or the right biology. They are the product of someone deciding on some otherwise ordinary day that another person deserves to be in the room, and then meaning it, all the way forward. She looked out over 211 graduates and the families assembled behind them in the imperfect June light. Wherever you go from here, whatever room you're walking toward, whatever room you've been standing outside of, I want you to remember that somewhere, someone is behind a dying plant at a table built for one, and they are not asking to be rescued. They are asking in the specific way that people ask for the things they have needed longest and been denied most consistently to be seen, to be let in, to be told by someone who means it, "You're with me now." She gathered her notes from the podium, which she had not consulted once. "I hope you stand up. I hope you walk across whatever room you're in. I hope you mean it all the way forward." A final beat. "Thank you. And Dad, thank you. Mom." She looked at Owen, at Clara in Nora's lap. "All of you, all the way forward." In the third row, Clara had surrendered the zipper entirely and was watching her sister at the podium with the complete, unguarded attention of a 2-year-old encountering something that is large and real and not yet categorizable, but absolutely felt. Owen looked straight ahead, and the effort in his shoulders had reached its limit, and he did not fully succeed in the composure he had committed to, which was the most honest thing he could have done. Garrett looked at Nora. She was already looking at him. Her eyes were full in the way that comes when something arrives that you knew was coming, had seen approaching for years, had understood was inevitable, and were still not adequately prepared for when it landed, because some things bypass all the preparation and arrive directly in the place that preparation was built to protect. She had spent 22 years in rooms arranged around her absence rooms that accommodated everything in them except her actual presence rooms, that had been structured deliberately and otherwise to make her feel that her existence within them was provisional, contingent, subject to ongoing review. She had learned to navigate those rooms with extraordinary precision, and the learning had cost her things. She was still occasionally finding she was missing the way you discover an old injury when a specific movement you hadn't tried before reveals it. She was in a room that fit now. She had been in this room for 7 years since a man at a wedding stood up from his assigned seat and meant the 6 words he said, and it still surprised her sometimes not the room, but the fitting, not the fact of being somewhere, but the fact of being somewhere entirely, with all of herself present, and none of it held back against the possibility of departure. She had stopped waiting for the departure. She had stopped waiting, which was the larger thing. Garrett squeezed her hand. Owen leaned forward slightly to catch Nora's eye past his father and gave her the small nod that was his complete vocabulary for the thing he did not say aloud, and she returned it in exactly the same register, which was how they had always spoken to each other about the important things. Clara, satisfied that the large room had been adequately attended to, returned her attention to the zipper. On the stage, Wren took her place in the graduating line. She looked straight ahead, already oriented toward the next thing, not because the present moment was insufficient, but because she had learned from a man who finally stood up and a woman who finally walked through an open door that the next thing was worth moving toward. That belonging was not a state you achieved and then possessed. It was a practice daily, a door kept open, a choice remade in small ways across ordinary mornings and ordinary evenings, and the specific ordinary grace of a kitchen where everyone was allowed to cook and everyone was told to stay. The ceremony continued. Outside, the June light moved across the parking lot and the playing fields and the roads leading away from the school in every direction, falling on everything equally the way light does when no one is managing it freely, without condition touching everything it reached. In the third row, a family of 5 sat together in a room built for everyone, taking up exactly the space they were owed.